The summer heat of 1987 pressed down on Phoenix like a suffocating blanket, the kind that made asphalt shimmer like water and turned car door handles into branding irons. Rebecca Martinez, 28, wiped the sweat from her forehead as she locked up the small travel agency where she worked on Central Avenue. The neon sign flickered in the window. Desert Dreams Travel, casting pink shadows across the empty sidewalk. She'd been planning other people's adventures for 3 years, but tonight she was finally embarking on her own. David Coleman, 31, was waiting for her in his dusty blue Ford Explorer, the engine running to keep the air conditioning alive. He worked construction during the day, his hands permanently stained with concrete dust and motor oil, but his weekends belonged to the wilderness. They'd been dating for 8 months, and this weekend trip to the remote canyons near Sedona was supposed to be special. The first time they'd traveled together, away from the city noise and the weight of their separate lives. "Ready for some real desert city girl?" David grinned as Rebecca slid into the passenger seat, her camera bag clutched tightly in her lap. She'd borrowed the expensive Nikon from her boss, promising to bring back photos that could fill their travel brochures with authentic Arizona magic. If you're watching this story unfold, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries that time couldn't bury. These stories matter, and your support helps keep them alive. They drove north as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Rebecca had mapped out their route meticulously. They'd take Highway 17 north to Camp Verde, then follow the back roads toward the lesser-known canyons that David had discovered during his solo hiking expeditions. He knew places where ancient petroglyphs still decorated red rock walls, where silence was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat echoing off the canyon walls. "My grandfather used to bring me out here when I was a kid," David said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the road. "Said the desert would teach you things about yourself you never knew you needed to learn." Rebecca smiled, snapping a photo of his profile against the darkening landscape. She had no idea that this image would later become crucial evidence, the last known photograph of David Coleman alive. They stopped for gas in Camp Verde as the first stars appeared. The station attendant, a weathered man named Jimmy Yazzie, would later remember them clearly, the young woman with the bright smile asking about sunrise spots for photography, the quiet man buying extra bottles of water and checking his tire pressure twice. Jimmy had worked that station for 15 years, and something about the couple stuck with him. Maybe it was the way they looked at each other, like they were sharing a secret the rest of the world wasn't ready to hear. "You folks be careful out there," Jimmy had said, handing David his change. "Desert's been acting strange lately. Had 3 different groups come through this week talking about seeing lights where there shouldn't be any, hearing sounds that don't belong." David had just nodded, but Rebecca leaned forward, her journalist's instincts prickling. "What kind of sounds?" she asked. Jimmy shrugged. "Hard to say. Like machinery, but deeper. Like the earth itself was groaning." They left the station just after sunset, following a dirt road that snaked between towering saguaro cacti and jagged rock formations. David had been down this route before, but never at night, never with someone else depending on him to navigate safely. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing glimpses of the alien landscape, twisted Joshua trees that looked like desperate hands reaching toward the stars, boulder formations that resembled sleeping giants. 15 miles from the main highway, David pulled over at what looked like a natural clearing, surrounded by red rock walls. "This is it," he said, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle ticking of the cooling engine and the distant call of a coyote. Rebecca stepped out and immediately looked up, gasping at the canopy of stars stretching endlessly above them. In the city, she'd forgotten that the universe was this vast, this overwhelming. They set up camp quickly. A simple dome tent, a small propane stove for coffee in the morning, sleeping bags that would keep them warm when the desert temperature dropped 40 degrees after midnight. David had done this dozens of times, but sharing it with Rebecca felt different. He watched her move around their temporary home, her city awkwardness gradually giving way to something more natural, more connected to the landscape around them. "Listen," Rebecca whispered, settling beside him on a flat boulder that still held the day's heat. David tilted his head, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. At first, there was nothing but the typical desert symphony, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. But then, barely perceptible, came something else. A low, rhythmic humming that seemed to rise from the ground itself. "Probably just wind through some cave system," David said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. He'd spent countless nights in the desert and had never heard anything quite like it. The sound seemed to pulse, almost like a heartbeat, and it was growing stronger. Rebecca reached for her camera, instinctively documenting the strangeness of the moment. The flash briefly illuminated their campsite, the tent glowing like a paper lantern. David's face turned toward the darkness, listening intently. Neither of them noticed the pair of headlights that had appeared on the ridge above them, stationary and watching. As the night deepened, the humming sound continued, sometimes fading to nothing, sometimes rising to an almost mechanical intensity. David suggested they retreat to the tent, but Rebecca was mesmerized. She'd never experienced anything like this. The desert felt alive, aware, as if it were trying to communicate something important. She loaded a fresh roll of film, determined to capture whatever was happening, unaware that she was about to photograph something that would puzzle investigators for nearly 2 decades. The last entry in Rebecca's small travel journal, found years later, was written that night by flashlight. "The desert is singing to us." David thinks I'm crazy, but I swear the rocks themselves are humming. There's something here, something old and patient. I can feel it watching us, but not in a threatening way. More like recognition, like it's been waiting for us specifically. The journal would be discovered 18 years later, buried under 3 feet of sand and debris, its pages somehow preserved by the dry climate and the protective leather cover. Neither Rebecca nor David slept well that first night. They took turns sitting outside the tent, listening to the strange sounds and watching the sky. Around 3 a.m., David woke to find Rebecca's sleeping bag empty. He found her standing about 50 yards from their camp, perfectly still, staring at a formation of rocks that seemed to glow faintly in the starlight. When he called her name, she turned with a strange, peaceful expression. "Do you see it?" she whispered. "The way the rocks are arranged. They're not natural, David. Someone put them there, arranged them in a pattern." David looked where she was pointing and saw only the random scatter of boulders that time and weather had deposited throughout the canyon. But Rebecca seemed convinced she was seeing something more, something deliberate and meaningful. They returned to the tent, but neither slept again. As dawn approached, painting the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, they made coffee and shared a simple breakfast of granola bars and dried fruit. The mysterious sounds had stopped with the sunrise, leaving only the normal desert awakening, birds calling, insects beginning their daily activities, the gradual warming of the air. David suggested they explore some of the nearby canyons before the heat became unbearable. Rebecca eagerly agreed, loading her camera with fresh film and filling her water bottles. They left their campsite intact, planning to return by midday and then head back to Phoenix that evening. The last photograph on Rebecca's camera, developed weeks later when her effects were finally processed, showed David climbing up a narrow trail between 2 massive red rocks, his hand extended to help her follow. His face was turned back toward the camera, smiling, completely unaware that they were walking deeper into a mystery that would consume them both. The trail they followed had no official designation, no markers or signs. David had discovered it months earlier during one of his solo expeditions, drawn by the unusual rock formations and the sense of profound isolation. It wound deeper into the canyon system, past ancient petroglyphs that seemed to dance in the shifting light, past pools of water that shouldn't have existed in such an arid landscape. As they walked, Rebecca continued taking photographs, documenting not just the scenery, but the strange details that kept catching her attention. Rocks that seemed deliberately stacked, patches of sand that showed unusual patterns, shadows that fell in ways that defied the sun's position. Her artistic eye, trained by years of arranging perfect vacation shots for her travel agency clients, recognized that something was orchestrated about this landscape, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. They were approximately 2 miles from their campsite when David stopped abruptly. Ahead of them, the trail split into 3 distinct paths, each leading deeper into the canyon system. David was certain he'd never seen this junction before. In his previous visits, the trail had continued straight for another mile before ending at a natural amphitheater of red rock. The landscape itself seemed to have changed, rearranged itself while they slept. "Which way?" Rebecca asked, already raising her camera to document the mysterious junction. David studied each path carefully. The leftmost trail descended sharply into what looked like a narrow gorge. The center path climbed steadily upward, disappearing around a bend marked by a towering natural arch. The rightmost path seemed to lead toward a grove of cottonwood trees that shouldn't have been able to survive in this environment. Before David could respond, they both heard it again, the low, rhythmic humming that had kept them awake. But now it seemed to be coming from all 3 paths simultaneously, as if the junction itself was the source of the strange sound. Rebecca began taking rapid photographs, her camera clicking steadily as she tried to capture something that seemed to exist just beyond the edge of perception. In the final photographs recovered from Rebecca's camera, barely visible but undeniably present are several anomalies that investigators would puzzle over for years. Shadows that don't correspond to any visible objects. Patterns in the sand that suggest recent human activity despite the remoteness of the location. And in one image, taken as Rebecca documented the mysterious trail junction, a figure that appears to be watching them from the ridge above, too distant and indistinct to identify, but clearly human, clearly aware of their presence. David chose the center path, drawn by some instinct he couldn't explain. As they climbed higher into the canyon system, the landscape became increasingly surreal. Rock formations took on almost architectural qualities, as if ancient builders had carved galleries and chambers from the living stone. The cottonwood trees they'd seen from the junction were indeed thriving here, fed by an underground spring that created an oasis of green in the harsh desert environment. It was in this hidden valley, surrounded by walls of red rock that soared hundreds of feet into the cloudless sky, that Rebecca and David encountered something that would change the trajectory of their lives forever. At the center of the oasis, partially hidden by the cottonwood grove, stood a structure that clearly wasn't natural, a circular arrangement of carefully placed stones, each one carved with symbols that resembled the ancient petroglyphs they'd seen throughout their hike, but somehow more complex, more intentional. Rebecca approached the stone circle while David hung back, his construction worker's practical mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The stones were massive, each one weighing several tons, arranged with mathematical precision. The symbols carved into their surfaces weren't random scratches or natural erosion. They were deliberate, purposeful, telling some kind of story that neither Rebecca nor David could decipher. As Rebecca circled the mysterious structure, Documenting it from every angle, she became aware that the humming sound was strongest here. It seemed to emanate from the stones themselves, as if they were somehow alive, somehow aware of her presence. David called for her to step away, his voice tight with an anxiety he couldn't explain, but Rebecca was transfixed. She'd spent her career helping people find beautiful, exotic locations, but she'd never encountered anything that felt this ancient, this significant. The photographs Rebecca took of the stone circle would later become the subject of intense scrutiny by archaeologists, geologists, and investigators. The symbols carved into the stones didn't match any known Native American petroglyphs from the region. The arrangement itself suggested knowledge of astronomy and mathematics that seemed inconsistent with the primitive tools that would have been available to ancient peoples. Most puzzling of all, geological analysis of the stone suggested it wasn't local. The mineral composition matched rock formations found hundreds of miles away, raising questions about how such massive stones could have been transported to this remote location. But in the moment, Rebecca and David were simply overwhelmed by the magnitude of their discovery. They'd stumbled upon something that could rewrite the archaeological understanding of the American Southwest, something that proved ancient peoples had achieved levels of sophistication that mainstream science had never acknowledged. Rebecca used all her remaining film documenting the site, while David carefully sketched the arrangement in a small notebook he always carried. As the sun reached its zenith and the desert heat became oppressive, they reluctantly decided to return to their campsite. They would come back better prepared, with more film, with camping gear that would allow them to spend several days studying the site. Rebecca was already mentally composing the letter she would write to National Geographic, the article she would propose to Desert Magazine. This discovery could launch her into a completely different career, transform her from a small-town travel agent into a respected researcher and writer. The return journey to their campsite should have taken less than an hour, but after 2 hours of hiking, they found themselves in unfamiliar territory. The trail they'd followed that morning seemed to have vanished, replaced by a maze of narrow canyons and dead-end passages that led nowhere. David's usually reliable sense of direction failed him completely. Every ridge looked the same. Every rock formation seemed identical to the last. As afternoon stretched into evening, panic began to set in. They'd consumed most of their water during the day's exploration, and the temperature was beginning to drop rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the canyon walls. David tried to retrace their steps, following his own boot prints in the sand, but the prints seemed to lead in circles, always returning them to the same boulder field, the same cluster of dying juniper trees. Rebecca suggested they return to the stone circle. At least they knew where that was, and the oasis would provide water and some shelter for the night. But when they tried to retrace their path to the mysterious site, they found only blank rock walls where the hidden valley should have been. The trail that had led them to their incredible discovery had simply disappeared, as if the landscape itself was conspiring to keep them lost. As darkness fell, they were forced to accept that they would be spending the night in the open desert with minimal supplies. David used his construction experience to build a small shelter against a rock wall using fallen branches and their limited gear. Rebecca rationed their remaining water and tried to stay positive, joking that this would make an amazing story someday, that their grand adventure was just getting started. But privately, both of them were terrified. The desert at night was a different world. Temperatures that could drop below freezing, predators both human and animal, the constant threat of dehydration and exposure. The strange humming sound they'd heard the previous night seemed to be everywhere now, emanating from the rocks themselves, growing stronger as the hours passed. David kept watch while Rebecca tried to sleep, but rest was impossible. Every sound seemed amplified in the thin desert air, the scrabble of small animals moving through the brush, the distant howl of coyotes, and underneath it all, that persistent mechanical humming that defied explanation. Around midnight, David woke Rebecca with an urgent whisper. "Look," he said, pointing toward the ridge above them. A line of lights was moving along the canyon rim, too organized and purposeful to be natural phenomena. They appeared to be following some kind of pattern, stopping at regular intervals before continuing their strange procession. The lights were too bright to be flashlights, too steady to be campfires, and they moved with a deliberate intelligence that ruled out any natural explanation. Rebecca grabbed her camera, but when she tried to photograph the mysterious lights, her flash failed to work. The camera that had functioned perfectly all day was now completely dead, its battery somehow drained despite being nearly new. David's attempts to signal the lights by shouting and waving their small flashlight produced no response. The procession continued its methodical movement along the ridge, seeming to follow some predetermined route that took no account of the lost hikers below. As dawn approached, exhaustion and dehydration began to take their toll. Rebecca was becoming increasingly disoriented, convinced that she could hear voices calling her name from deeper in the canyon system. David struggled to keep her focused on their immediate survival needs, finding water, creating better shelter, conserving their energy for what would certainly be a difficult day ahead. The morning sun revealed their situation in harsh detail. They were completely lost in a maze of canyons that seemed to shift and change when they weren't looking. The landmarks David had carefully noted the previous day were gone, replaced by rock formations he was certain he'd never seen before. Their footprints from the night before led in impossible directions, sometimes appearing to climb vertical rock faces or disappear entirely in the middle of flat, sandy areas. Rebecca's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of dehydration, exposure, and the psychological stress of their situation was pushing her toward collapse. She began talking to people who weren't there, having conversations with her mother, her colleagues at the travel agency, people from her childhood she hadn't thought about in years. David realized that if they didn't find help soon, they would both die in this seemingly endless maze of red rock and shadow. It was then that they encountered the figure that would haunt investigators for decades. A man appeared at the mouth of one of the canyons, walking toward them with calm, measured steps. He was tall and lean, dressed in clothing that seemed to belong to an earlier era, worn denim and leather boots, a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. David called out to him, his voice cracking with relief and desperation, but the figure didn't respond immediately. When the stranger finally reached them, his presence was both comforting and unsettling. He seemed to know exactly where they were, exactly how they'd become lost, but he offered no explanation for his own presence in such a remote location. He carried no visible supplies, no water or food, yet he appeared completely at ease in an environment that was slowly killing Rebecca and David. "You've been looking for something," the stranger said, his voice carrying an accent that David couldn't quite place. "Found more than you bargained for, I'd guess." Rebecca struggled to focus on his face, but the features seemed to shift in the harsh morning light, making it impossible to form a clear impression of his appearance. The stranger offered to guide them back to their campsite, and David accepted immediately. They had no choice. Rebecca could barely walk, and David's own judgment was compromised by exhaustion and dehydration. The man led them through passages that David was certain hadn't existed the day before, following paths that seemed to open up just ahead of their footsteps and close again behind them. After what felt like hours of walking, they emerged into the familiar clearing where they'd made their original camp. Their tent was exactly as they'd left it, their supplies untouched, their vehicle parked in the shade of a large boulder. But something was wrong. David's watch showed that only a few hours had passed since they'd left to explore the canyon, yet he was certain they'd been lost for more than 24 hours. Rebecca collapsed next to the tent, her camera bag still clutched in her hands despite everything they'd endured. David turned to thank their mysterious rescuer, but the man had vanished as silently as he'd appeared. The canyon that had led them back to their campsite was gone, replaced by a solid wall of red rock that showed no sign of any passage. As David helped Rebecca into the Explorer and began the long drive back to Phoenix, both of them tried to make sense of what they'd experienced. The photographs in Rebecca's camera told a story that seemed impossible, images of the stone circle that looked like they'd been taken in a completely different landscape, pictures of rock formations that didn't match anything in the surrounding area, and in several frames the mysterious figure who had rescued them, always partially obscured, but undeniably present. They agreed not to tell anyone about their experience, at least not immediately. Who would believe them? The story was too strange, too inconsistent with the rational world they both lived in. Rebecca returned to her job at the travel agency. David went back to his construction projects, and life resumed its normal rhythm. But both of them were changed by their time in the desert, marked by an experience that defied explanation. Over the following weeks, Rebecca became obsessed with researching the area where they'd been lost. She spent hours at the Phoenix Public Library studying geological surveys, archaeological reports, historical accounts of the region. What she discovered only deepened the mystery. The canyons they'd explored weren't shown on any official maps. The oasis, with its impossible cottonwood trees, didn't appear in any botanical surveys, and there was no record of the massive stone circle they'd photographed. David tried to return to the site twice, following the same route they'd taken that fateful weekend, but each time the landscape seemed different. The dirt road that had led to their original campsite was sometimes there, sometimes not. The distinctive rock formations that had served as landmarks appeared to shift positions, and the narrow canyon that had led to their incredible discovery was never there when he looked for it. 3 months after their desert experience, Rebecca received a phone call that would change everything. A man's voice, unfamiliar but somehow expected, spoke just a few words. "You took something that doesn't belong to you. It needs to be returned." The line went dead before she could respond, but Rebecca knew immediately what he meant. The photographs, the evidence of their discovery, the proof that something extraordinary existed in the Arizona desert. She tried to ignore the call, tried to convince herself it was just a prank or a wrong number, but over the following days, she began to notice that she was being watched. A figure in a wide-brimmed hat would appear at the edge of her vision, always too distant to see clearly, always gone when she turned for a better look. Her car was sometimes parked differently than she remembered leaving it, and she had the unsettling sensation that someone had been in her apartment while she was at work. David experienced similar phenomena, the feeling of being observed, objects in his apartment that seemed to have been moved, phone calls where no one spoke, but the line remained open. They met secretly to compare their experiences, and both agreed that whatever they'd encountered in the desert wasn't finished with them. The strange humming sound that had characterized their lost weekend began appearing in their daily lives, sometimes emanating from electrical appliances, sometimes seeming to rise from the ground itself. The pressure became unbearable. Rebecca began suffering from severe insomnia, afraid to sleep because her dreams were filled with images of the stone circle and the mysterious figure who had rescued them. David found himself making excuses to avoid working on construction sites in remote areas, terrified that he might encounter something that would remind him of their desert experience. Finally, they made a decision that would seal their fate. They would return to the desert one more time, not to explore or investigate, but to return the photographs as the mysterious caller had demanded. Rebecca would bring all the film she'd shot that weekend, including the negatives she'd had developed at a small photo lab in Tempe. They would find some way to access the hidden valley, leave the photographs at the stone circle, and hopefully end the psychological torment that had plagued them for months. They left Phoenix early on a Saturday morning in November 1987, driving the same route they'd taken that first time. The weather was cooler now, the brutal summer heat replaced by the mild temperatures that made Arizona winters famous. Rebecca had packed carefully, water, food, camping gear for several days if necessary. She was determined to resolve this situation, to find some kind of closure that would allow her to return to her normal life. The dirt road that led to their original campsite was there this time, clearly visible and well maintained. They found the familiar clearing without difficulty, set up their tent in the same location, and prepared for what they both sensed would be their final encounter with the mystery that had consumed their lives. As darkness fell, the humming sound returned, stronger than ever. It seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats, creating a strange resonance that made it difficult to think clearly. Rebecca clutched the envelope containing her photographs, while David kept watch for any sign of the figure who had rescued them months earlier. He appeared just after midnight, emerging from the shadows as if he'd been waiting for exactly the right moment. This time, Rebecca was able to see his face clearly in the moonlight, weathered and ageless, with eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge that no human should possess. He approached their camp slowly, his hands visible and empty, but there was something about his presence that made both Rebecca and David deeply uneasy. "You brought them back," he said, looking directly at the envelope in Rebecca's hands. "That's good. Some things aren't meant to be shared with the world above." Rebecca held out the photographs, but the stranger made no move to take them. Instead, he gestured toward the canyon walls surrounding their campsite. "Follow me," he said simply, and turned to walk toward a passage that David was certain hadn't been there moments before. They had no choice but to follow, leaving their camp behind as they entered the maze of canyons that had trapped them months earlier. This time, however, the journey was different. The passages were clearly defined, the route direct and purposeful. Within an hour, they found themselves back in the hidden valley with its impossible oasis and the mysterious stone circle. But now, in the cold November moonlight, they could see that they weren't alone. Figures stood among the cottonwood trees, men and women in clothing from different eras, all watching silently as Rebecca and David approached the ancient stones. Some appeared to be Native Americans in traditional dress. Others looked like Spanish conquistadors. Still others wore the practical clothing of modern hikers and campers. All of them had the same ageless quality as their mysterious guide, the same unsettling sense of existing outside normal time. "Who are they?" Rebecca whispered, but she already knew the answer. These were others who had discovered this place, others who had encountered something they weren't meant to see, others who had tried to take evidence back to the world above. They were all here now, permanent residents of this impossible valley, guardians of its secrets. The guide gestured for Rebecca to place the photographs at the center of the stone circle. As she knelt to comply, the carved symbols on the massive stones began to glow with a faint, pulsing light. The humming sound reached a crescendo that seemed to vibrate through their bones, and Rebecca felt a profound sense of completion, as if she was finally fulfilling her true purpose. David reached for her hand, trying to pull her away from the circle, but it was too late. The light from the stones intensified, and Rebecca felt herself being drawn into something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting patiently for her return. The last thing she remembered was the sound of David calling her name, his voice already seeming to come from very far away. When the searchers found their campsite 3 days later, everything was exactly as it should be. Tent properly set up, supplies neatly organized, vehicle parked in the shade. But Rebecca Martinez and David Coleman were gone, vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The only clue was a camera bag found near the cold ashes of their campfire, empty of film but containing a small notebook filled with sketches of symbols that matched no known writing system. For 18 years, their disappearance remained a mystery. The official investigation concluded that they had become lost while hiking and had died of exposure, their bodies eventually consumed by desert scavengers. But hikers in the area occasionally reported strange phenomena. Lights moving along the canyon rims at night, the sound of voices calling from empty passages, the sensation of being watched by invisible observers. Then, in 2005, a GPS system in David's Explorer began transmitting a signal. The vehicle had been impounded and forgotten in a Phoenix police lot, but somehow its navigation system had become active, broadcasting coordinates that led to a remote canyon 18 miles from where they had originally camped. When investigators followed the signal, they found something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the case. The canyon contained clear signs of recent human habitation, a shelter built from local materials, tools fashioned from desert plants, evidence of a fire that had burned within the last few months. Most disturbing of all, they found Rebecca's camera, its battery somehow still functional after nearly 2 decades, containing a single photograph that had been taken just days before the GPS signal began transmitting. The image showed 2 figures standing beside a familiar stone circle, older now, but unmistakably Rebecca and David. They appeared healthy and at peace, their arms around each other as they smiled at the camera. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows between the ancient stones, other figures watched approvingly, the same ageless guardians who had witnessed their final night in the desert 18 years earlier. The photograph was impossible, the GPS signal inexplicable, but the evidence was undeniable. Somewhere in the vast desert of Arizona, in a place that existed between the normal world and something far older, Rebecca Martinez and David Coleman had found their true home. The desert had claimed them, but not as victims, as willing participants in a mystery that stretched back thousands of years, guardians of secrets that were never meant to be shared with the outside world. Investigators sealed the case file with a classification that ensured it would never be opened again. The canyon was designated off-limits, the coordinates deleted from all official records. But sometimes, on clear desert nights when the stars shine with unusual brightness, hikers in the area report hearing voices carried on the wind, a man and woman laughing together, their joy echoing off ancient stone walls, their love strong enough to transcend the boundaries between worlds. The GPS in David's Explorer went silent the day after the photograph was discovered, its battery finally failing after its impossible 18-year transmission. But the message had been delivered, the truth finally revealed. Rebecca and David hadn't died in the desert. They had been chosen by it, selected to join the eternal guardians of its most profound secrets. Their story became legend among the few who knew the full truth, a reminder that some places in the American Southwest still belong to forces older than human civilization, older than recorded history, older than time itself. And in the hidden valley, where cottonwood trees grow in defiance of the desert climate, where ancient stones pulse with mysterious energy, where the boundaries between past and present dissolve in the endless cycle of the seasons, Rebecca Martinez and David Coleman continue their greatest adventure, not as lost souls, but as willing participants in a mystery that will endure long after the cities of Arizona have crumbled to dust and returned to the patient, eternal desert that gave them birth.